Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jillian Dunks, and I am an archivist in McMaster Library's Department of Archives and Research Collections. Today, I will be moderating this session, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to Wherein She Plainly Shows Women of the Printing Trades in the Hand Press Era, an Archives Alive lecture provided by Ruth-Ellen St. Onge and Myron Groover. Before the presentation begins, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the original and current inhabitants of this land, the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, on whose territories I, as a Hamilton resident and a McMaster employee, now live. This land is protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and allied nations to peaceably care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes. Hamilton is also covered by the Between the Lakes Treaty No. 3 of 1792, and that is a treaty between the Anishinaabewin-speaking Mississauga people and the Crown. The theme of today's event is women's involvement in printing, and the lecture will no doubt touch on ways in which European society's systemic misogyny created barriers for women working in the printing trades. Misogyny and colonialism are entwined forces, so today I want to honor and to highlight the Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and non-binary individuals who are challenging both forces in our region. There is Janet Marie Rogers, a Mohawk and Tuscarora writer who currently runs Ogista Publishing at Six Nations. There is Lenore Kishig Tobias, an Anishinaabe writer who has long critiqued cultural appropriation in the Canadian publishing industry and has organized many significant events for Indigenous and racialized writers, including the now famed Writing Through Race Conference in 1994. And there is Maria Campbell, a Métis writer whose memoir, Half-Breed, is a seminal piece of Indigenous literary history in this country. These are only some names among many. I encourage you to buy their books, learn from their words, and begin the journey of understanding and dismantling the misogyny and colonialism in this area. Now I'll transition to talking about the event series. The talk that you'll see today is part of the library's programming for Transformative Stories, the Year of Gender and Justice. This is a series of events, resources, and exhibits focused on the themes of gender and justice, running from fall 2023 to summer 2024. Please come to our department in the basement of Mills Memorial Library to see an in-person display of the volumes discussed today. This event is also part of the Archives Alive series, which introduces members of the public to the unique holdings of the Department of Archives and Research Collections. Lastly, I will introduce our speakers. First, we have Ruth-Ellen St. Onge. Ruth-Ellen joined McMaster University as the Distinctive Collections Cataloging Librarian in March 2023. She previously worked as Associate Curator of the Teaching Collections of Rare Books School at the University of Virginia from 2015 to 2022. She holds a Master of Information Studies degree and a doctorate in French and Book History and Print Culture from the University of Toronto. Her research interests include the history of publishing and book illustration from the early modern period to the present day. She recently co-authored Building the Book from the Ancient World to the Present Day from the Legacy Press in 2022. She is the past president of the Bibliographical Society of Canada and has also served in a variety of roles on the committees and boards of the Bibliographical Society of America and the Fine Press Association. Myron Groover is McMaster University's Archives and Rare Books Librarian. He read history at the University of Aberdeen and library archival studies at the University of British Columbia. His work focuses on collection development, curating, and teaching with archives and rare books. His academic interests include book history, the material culture of text, and the history of ideas. Some final housekeeping reminders before we begin. This session will be recorded. There will be time at the end of the session for questions. Please submit your questions for the speakers using the Q&A section of Zoom. And my colleague Bridget Whittle will also be monitoring the Zoom chat to answer any questions that may arise there. Without any further ado, I will turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you, Jillian, for that warm introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon, or whatever time it is where you are. We're really delighted to have you all with us today. I do have some slides, so I'll go ahead and share my screen with you here. We're really happy to be here today to talk about a project that we've been working on for the last little while here, which we're really excited is coming to fruition at this point with the installation of our physical exhibit about a week ago. And we thought we might start with a quick glimpse at our print collections in general here at McMaster, a micro glimpse, if you will. The hand press era titles in the collection number some 40,000 volumes. Never trust any librarian who tells you they know exactly how many books they have in their collection. We're safe and no exceptions. So we say about 40,000. More are being added to the collection all the time. We continue to take donations of single volumes or entire libraries, and we maintain an active purchasing program for new acquisitions. So this is a growing collection of which we're very proud. Linguistically, the coverage is primarily from the British Isles, mostly in English. A lot of Irish imprints, almost all in English, however. But we have a very, very strong holdings in French as well. French and Latin are probably the second and third most well-represented collection languages in the hand press collection, but also significant numbers of books in Italian, German, Spanish, Dutch, and a couple of other languages. So it's a really rich collection to work with in terms of printing history of kind of Northwestern Europe. I always like to emphasize in a slide like this that this collection is open to the public. Our division is proudly open to the public. This collection is used very, very heavily in support of teaching and learning, both on and beyond campus. So if you are interested in working in person with any of the artifacts that we talk about today, or if any of the collections we talk about pique your interest, please feel welcome and feel invited to visit us in person and work with these materials. We would love to have you come in and work with this collection. And we'll continue before we get into our content of looking at some of the artifacts that we've curated for this exhibit. We might take a little bit of a look at the status of women in Northwestern Europe in the early modern period. Look at their legal and cultural status and the roles that they played in printing. So, in terms of legal and cultural status, women in the early modern period really they face numerous structural impediments, structural barriers to full participation in what we might think of as the formal infrastructure of commerce, membership in guilds, the ability to own property, the ability to kind of have full agency over your own inheritance and the disposition of your goods when you pass away. Your ability to inherit things from other people in your family is circumscribed by your womanhood in this case. So in all cases, we're dealing with societies where women lack the same legal status as men. And very often, legally and socially, women are actually defined in terms of their relationship to the men in their lives. So women will be legally defined as a parent of a person, as the wife or widow of a person, as the daughter of a person. And this is really visible in the area of inheritance and the area of the disposition of property and bequests when someone passes away, because women did not have equal rights to inherit property or bequeath property upon their own passing to their chosen heirs. In the case of one of the printers we'll look at today, it was an individual who did leave their bequest to their eldest daughter, who, as a married woman, the bequest went straight to the husband as a feature of the legal system, although she was the beneficiary of the bequest. So that's the kind of the context, which is quite grim. But in spite of these forms of structural discrimination, women are working actively and extensively in all aspects of print culture throughout the hand press period from the very, very early days. So it would be a mistake to assume that because of these structural barriers, women are not participating in these trades, in these areas of enterprise. And that's one of the things that we hope to confound today, building on some of the excellent scholarship that's been done in the last decades and centuries. And now go ahead.
Thanks, Myron. One important thing to remember is that the printing industry in the early modern period in Europe was really dominated by families and family networks. So women who were part of a printing family would often be involved in many tasks that were going on in the operation at that time. So they could be correcting, composing, keeping accounts, writing letters, etc. And they would be doing this from a very early age. We know, for example, this was the case for the daughters of Christophe Plantin and his wife Jeanne Rivière. So one of their daughters, Katerina, was very skilled at account keeping. Another daughter, Magdalena, was trained to correct proofs in several languages. In addition to family members in the printing trades, we often see that women and children were used as cheap or unpaid labor for tasks like sewing gatherings, hand coloring prints, etc. And because it was a family type business, printers were often living within or adjacent to their operation, so that you didn't have the same kind of division between family life and work life. And you could sometimes see young women working for wages in these industries, but what they would often do was when they're very young, they might move to the city to work as a wage laborer in order to save up money for their dowry. Then they would go back home, and then that money would go into establishing a family. So they wouldn't necessarily be being training in the same way that a young male apprentice would be training. They wouldn't become then a member of that trade. They would go on to be married and be a homemaker, for example. And so there are all these women involved in the industry in many different ways. Today, we're going to be focusing mostly on women who were running presses and publishing operations. So just to give some statistics, in France, thanks to Roméo Arbour, who was a professor at the University of Ottawa, he did a very important work, a dictionary of women publishers in France during this time period. And he identified 1,732 women who worked as printers and publishers from the 15th to the 18th century. And he has, shows through his work that women made up a significant portion of the workforce. And often, sometimes of all the presses operating in a place like Paris, a significant number would be run by widows at that time. So in 1697, 15 of the 36 presses in Paris were headed by widows. So women are really there in force from the beginning. And that's what we're hoping to talk about in more detail today. One of the problems, though, is that despite this very strong presence, historically, they have been erased or obscured. So Parker, who in an article for, I think it's Renaissance Quarterly, we have the citation at the end of our slides, she gives the example of an Italian woman printer, Girolama Cartolari, who, when her work was described in later centuries by bibliographers, they actually changed her name to Girolamo, so they made it a masculine name, even though it was clearly a woman who had printed the book. In the case of Anne Werner, who we won't talk about in our slides today, but who is in our exhibition, she was very involved and ran the firm of her husband after his death, Werner and Hood, but her name does not appear in the colophons or on the imprints. So she's there operating the business, but not listed. It's listed under the name of the firm. So those are just two of many challenges in trying to reveal these histories.
So you have these instances of deliberate erasure or of obfuscation. But another problem that confronts bibliography in this area is just the sheer scope of historical scholarship that has been done, the sheer scope of book historical enterprise that's been undertaken, both during and since the hand press era. There's actually a lot of historical scholarship that has a bearing on this discourse, and that's very, very useful. But as those of us who work with older sources are probably know, there is not even access to historical sources in contemporary scholarship. You might be dealing with older sources that have never been digitized. If they've been digitized, they may never have been OCR'd, which limits your ability to mine them for text. So some of the tools that we've become really accustomed to using are not much avail with a lot of non-digitized or older source scholarship. So, the uneven access and even the uneven awareness of that kind of work really has a bearing on book history in this area. And that's kind of a conundrum of the digital milieu for engagement with historical scholarship. Digitization, OCRing, ingestion of things into databases, which remember are often for profit, are complex processes at the end of a long tail of political economy, each stage of which results in further refinement of what people actually have access to. And engaging with both historical and contemporary scholarship in this area requires linguistic competencies, requires often navigation of archival sources, which may be unfamiliar to some of us working in bibliography and book history. The case that Ruth-Ellen just mentioned of the Plantin daughters, one of the reasons that we know so much about the Plantin Press is that their archival holdings are extremely complete, still extant and accessible, which is not a usual state of affairs for an early modern printer. So you need these kind of ability to navigate archival sources, also awareness of record keeping and business practices, so you know where to look. And this is documentation that has not uniformly been maintained or retained. So there are challenges, to say the least, in pursuing inquiry in this area.
And despite the fact that there have been many extremely well-documented massive projects on national histories of books, we don't always see the same interest paid to women in these national histories. So just because there's a multi-volume set on, say, the history of the book in France, some areas may include information on women in the industry, some may not. And so just because something is a recent resource, it may not be as well or comprehensive as we might like to think. And another example is that some of these women printers are not documented in things like name authority files. So that's something we'll talk about at the end about how we might want to remediate that.
So that leaves us with a question of where then do we look for women in print? If we have an interest in this area, if we want to know more, if we want to look for evidence of these lives and these practices and these artifacts. And I'd say in most cases, secondary scholarship is required first, because then, as in some of the examples that Ruth-Ellen has been given, the case of Werner and Hood, the husband passes away, the firm is called Werner and Hood, the widow's last name is still Werner, so the name of the business doesn't change. There's no indication that she has taken over her husband's part of the partnership. So you're not going to see a kind of a smoking gun clue in the colophon or the title page to indicate always that change has taken place. So looking for women in print in the hand press era can be a factor of really engaging with secondary research first. You need to kind of arm yourself with knowledge of what you're looking for and how to find it, because you won't be able to look for, women printers in a library catalog and have that be a heading that's appended to your records, unless you have a really excellent cataloger in your back pocket, which we fortunately do. But that's not the case everywhere. So you kind of need to know what you're looking for ahead of time and adopt some specific strategies for doing inquiry in this area. And I wanted to start, for the next part of the talk, we'll move into looking at some highlights of the individuals and artifacts that we've highlighted in the exhibit. And we thought it would be appropriate to start with Elinor James. It's from her work, actually, that the title of the exhibit comes, wherein she plainly shows is part of the title of a broadside that she published that we have in our collection and in the exhibit. She was born around 1645. We don't know exactly when. We know that she was about 17 years old when she married Thomas James in 1662. Thomas James was a printer. Their marriage seems to have occasionally been fractious through indirect evidence, which we'll get back to a little bit. For example, he was said to be very well read, and her printed output is charitably at times barely coherent. We know that he had this fantastic library. His friends comment on him being really well read. She doesn't seem to be super well read. It seems like he's actually denying her access to the library. Remember this, because we'll come back to this anecdote in a moment. So there's some tension in the marriage. And some contemporaries of Thomas James wrote of him when he was living that, he's a nice enough guy, but he's probably most well known for being the husband of the famous lady politician, Elinor James. She's frequently referred to as a controversialist, which when I told my partner this term, she was like, oh, this is my life's, now that I've heard this is my life's ambition. I want to be a controversialist. She was someone who really used her press to promulgate her own opinions. So she became almost a fixture of the religious and political commentariat of late Stuart England. She writes a lot on religious topics. She writes a lot on political topics. She was extremely prolific. She was actually one of the most prolific authors in sheer number of things attributable to her as a writer. She was one of the most prolific authors of the early modern period in English. She authored upwards of 90 pieces under her own name. So she wrote on some subjects that seem a little bit more esoteric today if you don't have as much knowledge. For purposes of this audience, one of the things that she wrote about a lot was printing. The political economy of printing, the legal regulations surrounding printing, how to run a print shop, what disasters would befall printing if certain legal measures that were being contemplated in Parliament were brought into force. So a very, very interesting person, and someone who's really locked up in the early modern legal tradition of petitions, which are these kind of semi-formal or formal documents that you submit to court in the hope that you will get an audience with the king to discuss your grievance. So when she's printing these things, she's printing them as petitions. And it's said that she is indeed taking them to the Lords and Commons and trying to get audiences. But the real purpose of these petitions is not to get them in front of the king, it's to get them in front of the public, to get her ideas directly in front of the public. So she attains a really enduring status as a public figure through this output. And this is someone who sort of really confounds our ideas of what is a printer? What is a compositor? What is a writer? What is an author? Because the evidence suggests that she's actually performing all of these processes simultaneously. She's drafting and writing her screeds on the press because she is militantly devoted to getting commentary out as quickly as possible after a new political development happens. So she's very well remembered, even decades after her death. There are annotations in semi-contemporary hands on some of her broadsides saying, oh, this was a mad woman during my father's time who was constantly like banging on the doors of the Houses of Parliament. So someone who becomes semi-legendary through this output. And I'll close with an amazing anecdote from her career, which is that coming back to this theme of the semi-fractious marriage with her husband, also a printer. So the husband bequeathed his press to Elinor when he passed away. But he imposed two conditions on this bequest, one of which was that she should never have access to his personal library. Not only should she not inherit it, she should have nothing to do with it. And second, there was a condition that she not molest or harass the execution of the will exactly as written. So, this is hefty stuff for someone you've been married to for a lengthy time. The amazing thing is, somehow she gets hold of the library anyway, after he has passed away. And she denotes it en bloc to Sion College, which is an Anglican institution of higher learning. And in the course of this bequest, she commissions a portrait of herself, identifying her as the wife of Thomas James, portrait we're looking at right now. In this portrait, she is clutching the Sion College Book of Benefactors, in which her bequest has recently been recorded, and in the background is one of her own screeds, one of her own pamphlets. So this is, we don't have many portraits of women printers. Here we have an example of one that she commissioned herself as a humble brag / I love you so much for her dear departed husband.
So the next person we'd like to talk about is la veuve Camusat. So veuve is the French word for widow. Her maiden name was Denise de Courbe, also sometimes written as Denise Courbet. She came from a printing family. Her brother, Augustin, was also a printer publisher. And in 1624, she married a very well-respected printer publisher called Jean Camusat. After he died, she served she took over his role as printer of the French Academy, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And then she later collaborated with her son-in-law, Pierre Le Petit, who became the official printer of the king. And then finally, later on in her life, she married another publisher called Louis de Villac. But during her career, she published more than 260 works of literature, history, theology, and spirituality. And unlike Elinor James, unfortunately, we don't have a portrait of her that I've found yet. However, we do have a portrait of her daughter who had the same name as her, Denise Camusat. And Myron, if you wouldn't mind just clicking. And so this is her daughter. The engraving was actually made by Antoine Trouvin, who attended Denise and Pierre Le Petit's wedding. So he was a family friend in some respect. And it just has a really beautiful inscription underneath that I've translated into English. This face offers to your eyes the sweetness and prudence of she whom Providence placed in eternal repose too early for her loved ones. So she had died at the age of 46. It continues, it is the face of a woman, but if you could see her soul, you would see the soul of a hero. So when I first read that to Myron, I was like, wow, like this is pretty intense devotion here. And if we want to move to the next slide, I think that she probably inherited some of her heroic qualities from her mother, who had to struggle quite intensely in order to hold on to her rights after her husband passed away. So you may be familiar with the French Academy, or the Académie Française. It was founded in 1635 by Cardinal Richelieu, and it has 40 members who are referred to as the Immortals, because they are members for life once they've been named to the institution. And it's one of the foremost French cultural institutions. Jean Camusat was named as the first official printer for the Academy, so this was a very prestigious role. And he printed the works of the institution, but also works written by Academy members. And his widow, after he died, normally would have the right to continue the business under his name. But Cardinal Richelieu was a villain in this case, as he was in many of the stories we've heard before. And he was actually seeking to replace the widow Camusat with another printer called Cramoisy. And it's through the letters of an Academy member of that time called Jean Chapelain, who was a poet and dramaturgist, that he talks about how the widow had to fight really hard to maintain her rights. So Jean Chapelain describes how she, after her husband died, Denise Camusat went to the homes of individual Academy members to lobby them. And she explained that the law permitted her to continue the business of her husband and to enjoy all his privileges, and that there should be no question of taking away this right, which she cherished the most, and on which was founded the subsistence of her family and her children. So the business really had to continue so that she could support her family. And at that time, when her husband died, they had actually 9 children, the youngest of which was only a year old. So she really needed to keep that contract going with the Academy. So Chapelain was very moved by her argument, and he wrote to other Academy members trying to support her and to make sure that she would hold on to this right. And here you see a picture of a title page from Paraphrases of the Letters of St. Paul. This was a work, a multi-volume work written by Bishop Antoine Godeau. And this work had begun when Jean Camusat was still alive. When he passed away, Jean Chapelain wrote on behalf of the widow to the bishop saying, I know you had this agreement with Jean Camusat. He's now passed away, but I really think that you should continue publishing your work through his widow, because she's just as able to do a great job as he was. And, you shouldn't take away this business from her. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll see that this was a successful endeavor, and that in the privilege, which is in French here, there's an addendum to the printing privilege explaining that the bishop has transferred the printing rights to the widow of Jean Camusat, and she went on to publish several volumes of these paraphrases of the letters of St. Paul. They're actually quite beautiful little books, and they have a distinctive armorial binding, which you'll see on the cover there. There's the cross of the Order of Malta. That's because they belonged to Jean de la Vieuville, who was a bailiff of this order and ambassador of the order to France. But the bindings were a little bit later from when the books were printed. Interestingly, the first woman to be inducted into the French Academy was only admitted in 1980, and that was Marguerite Yourcenar, the writer. And so, although one of the first printers of the French Academy was a woman, it took 350 years or so until women were able to become members of this cultural institution. And I think the next example we have is also French. So La Veuve Mazières, the widow Mazières, again was married to a printer and publisher, Raymond Mazières, in 1705. So she's from a little bit later than the Veuve Camusat. And after the death of her husband, she took over the business and she was very active for several more decades. She often worked with her nephew, Jean-Baptiste Garnier, so she had family connections outside of her marriage to the printing industry at that time. And she and Garnier served as official printers to the Queen. And her books were quite elaborate productions, so she's operating at a high end of the production at that time compared to someone like Elinor James, who's doing more broadsides and pamphlets. So the first example we have here is a biography of a French military commander, Turenne. It has this beautiful engraved frontispiece portrait. And actually, a lot of the book's decorations, not just the plates, but the initials and the headpieces are also printed intaglio. So the book would be printed with a regular letterpress press, but also would go through rolling presses, so much higher cost, and of course has this aristocratic connection. So we also have, if we go to the next slide, a very beautiful book that has several connections to women. So it was printed and published by La Veuve Mazières. It's a missal that was intended for use during Holy Week, so Office de la Semaine Sainte. And it was printed in honor of the Queen, Marie Ledzinska, who was the Queen of Louis XV. And it was also dedicated to the Queen, and in the dedication, which we don't have an image of here, the dedication is signed by the widow Mazières. So women being involved at different levels. The Queen, Marie, was actually very devout, and she often sponsored the printing and distribution of religious works. But it's not clear how exactly she was involved in this missal. We know that it was very, very popular. And the copy at McMaster actually has an armorial binding that has the coat of arms of the Queen herself. That doesn't necessarily mean that it belonged to the Queen. It could have belonged to a member of the Queen's household. And the book is very interesting in terms of the history of bookbinding. And we'll see if we go to the next slide. And we'll have to do some clicking here. Just click all the way through, Myron.
Okay.
A very elaborate binding, which at first glance looks like a typical fanfare binding, which normally, when you see this beautiful gilded decoration, it would have been done with multiple hand tools. So each mark made by the impression of one tool. But actually, this book was part of an early innovation of using a large metal plaque to create the overall pattern. So the areas that are circled in the slide show individual tools, but then the remaining, the big massive square here is all one block. And this made it much faster to produce, much less expensive. And that's because the people who were producing this book, so the publisher, La Veuve Mazières, and perhaps in association with binders who we haven't identified, they knew that these would sell, so that they made them in advance with these very beautiful bindings. And then the central panel was left blank so that the person who purchased the book could have their coat of arms impressed there in the central panel. In the upper corner, we actually see a mistake. So normally there would be a fleur-de-lis in each corner. On one side, they did something else, and then they tried to cover up their mistake by just using a roll to go over it. So it shows that although to our eyes it looks very lavish, they're actually being produced a little bit more quickly, and perhaps with less skill than a typical luxury binding at that time. And because they're so striking, these missals exist. To this day, there's a lot of copies available. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see that this is a copy we saw a couple weeks ago at the Toronto Antiquarian Book Fair. So the bookseller, Zubair Islam, actually allowed us to take a picture of it to show it's the same plaque that was used. It's also a copy of Office de la Semaine Sainte, but the coat of arms in the middle is for a different individual. And they tend to survive because they're quite beautiful and because they have this coat of arms aristocratic association in terms of provenance. So Giles Barber has done a lot of work on these book bindings, but in his article, he doesn't really talk about how perhaps the publisher, the widow Mazières, might have played a role in the creation of these more mass-produced but extremely popular missals that were used by members of the aristocracy during that time period.
Okay, staying en France for the moment, we wanted to move on and highlight something that is actually a very recent acquisition for us, something that we acquired within the last year. It's really exciting. I couldn't believe the listing when I saw it. This is an example of the output of the so-called Imprimerie des Femmes, or the originally started or conceptualized as L'École Typographique des Femmes, which was an effort that coalesced early during the French Revolution with kind of typically lofty ideological promise and premise behind it. It's very difficult to tell exactly when it started and exactly when it ended. We know they were active by 1790-ish. We think their last attested output is 1795-ish, but we just don't have very clear dates for the life of this concern. The premise of the press was to empower a skilled, trained, all-female workforce as a statement, to have a typographic foundry and a print shop all operating using exclusively women's expertise and labor. So it's a great premise. Like many ideas in the French Revolution, it perhaps did not live up to the loftiness of its premise. This is something that was established. There was an all-female workforce, an all-woman workforce. There was a perceptible and measurable output, but the documentation that surrounds this also suggests that this was a really fraught printing concern. This is something that was established sort of by fiat, with high ideological backing, but something that was not particularly well received by the established community of printers in France at the time. Printers tend to be very wary about regulatory intervention in the print industry. They tend to be very, very conservative at a certain point about established ways of doing things. So something disruptive like this, particularly something that confounds male printers' ideas of their own primacy in the trade, really opened up this press to a lot of hostility, so that it became kind of a road to hell paved with good intentions. And in light of those headwinds and the general just chaos in France at that time, and the factionalism within the revolution itself, it's kind of astonishing that this press survived as long as it did, and it's remarkable that we still have examples of their output. We were able to acquire recently a kind of a pamphlet length work by this press just this year, and it's a great pamphlet. It's quite crude. It's showing its age. It's lived and been loved to death. I think it's stab stitched, sort of interestingly, and most remarkably of all, it came to us still in its original stale state. So it still has a fragment of the original printer's discard wrap, which is a revolutionary proclamation. Ironically enough, that's what they had to hand as excess in the shop on that day. And it's really, really cool to see an example of something, sort of as it would have been purchased by somebody in the early 1790s. And we've actually been able to have our conservator Bronwyn Glover do some work with this text. And I want to thank her for her expertise, because she was able to do a lot to stabilize this artifact, while really maintaining its character, making it clear where we've made contemporary interventions, so not trying to elide or occlude the life that this artifact has lived. So we'd really encourage you to come and see it in person to see the amazing work that's been done with that artifact. And for our last example, we thought we would end with the output of Sarah Harding. So we've run a bit of a gamut in the—
Not quite the last example.
Oh, right, of course. Okay, penultimate, semi-penultimate example. You can tell we were working on these slides until like 10 minutes before the talk, as I'm sure none of you have ever done. Anyway, so Sarah Harding was, we're running the gamut in this presentation, from Elinor James producing like really rapid fire broadsides at a quite frankly crude level of technical output, often not even including an imprint, because she assumes everyone will know what she's talking about and that they couldn't possibly confuse her output for anyone else. Also, her name's always in the title. So we go from that to looking at some of these quite luxurious examples of technical output from France. And now we're going back sort of to the other end of the scale, the output of a working printer really at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, who is Sarah Harding. Sarah Harding was the daughter of an established Dublin printer. Remember what we were saying, printing often runs in families. People often learn the business young. Sarah was no exception. So learned her craft and art in the print shop of her own mother, and married a young man named John Harding. We're not super clear whether he was a printer prior to the marriage. It is entirely possible that she actually brought him into the industry, although of course the press ended up being under his name. One of the remarkable things about this press is that it's very, very close association with subversion. So Sarah and John Harding are working simultaneously on the press. They're both undertaking press work, and they're undertaking a lot of very subversive press work, particularly press work associated with the career of Jonathan Swift. They're possibly most famous as the printers of the Draper letters, which are these seismic events in Europe, in Irish political history. They get published in the early to mid 1720s. Anonymously, pseudonymously, like all of Swift's work at that time. And these had a huge impact on public discourse in Ireland. They were very, very subversive to the establishment of the day. They were extremely offensive to the establishment. There was actually a cash reward offered for persons who could connect the publication to its author and attribute it to its real author. So for much of the operation of this press, the printers are under either a Damoclean threat of imprisonment and financial penalty, or they're actually in jail. So John is actually imprisoned several times during the life of the press and during the course of the partnership with Swift. Partnership, perhaps an infelicitous term. We'll get back to that in a moment. We know that Sarah is capable of overseeing and running the press work herself, because whenever John's in jail, the printing doesn't stop. It continues under his imprint, when in fact it's her doing all of the press work when he's in prison. She does occasionally release one or two things under her own imprint, but it's clear that she's running the press while she's in jail. Gives the impression that they were really quite equal partners in the administrative oversight and in the press work itself. John actually dies, sadly, as a result of one of his imprisonments in 1724. He never recovers and has this kind of long period of decline, and passes away in 1725, at which point she takes over kind of complete operation of the press. And the story from here is kind of, it's very sad, actually. It's a very tragic story, but it's worth talking about because it gives a lot of insight into the kind of relationships and networks and systems of political economy that are supporting printing at this time. because Swift's support for this enterprise actually really starts to diminish around the time that John passes away. Draper letters had been, bestsellers, read by everyone. They were really, really famous. They were objects of, societal level opprobrium. After those, Swift's commissions for this press kind of start drying up. Sarah herself was imprisoned in 1725 for printing a poem. It's really quite a short poem, and one of those, you read it today and you're like, oh, this got someone thrown in jail. But at the time, it was a very, very offensive poem, saying that Minerva had turned her back on the clergy of Ireland for their stupidity or something, outrageous. So she was actually imprisoned herself in 1725. And by 1726, conditions for the press are so desperate that she actually issues a broadside, seemingly under the false imprint of her own mother, which is a long poem pleading for public support for the widow of the publisher of Draper's letters. Basically saying, my husband and I did, and really she's actually putting this all on her husband. My husband did an inestimable service to the people of Ireland. He's passed away. He left me behind a widow. I have 2 young children to support. I'm throwing myself on public mercy. I need more commissions to keep my family going. One of the commissions that came their way during this time period was the printing of the Intelligencer, which was this kind of periodical newspaper that Thomas Sheridan and Jonathan Swift started, really with the conceit of supporting her. They didn't actually need to do this. They did the periodical mostly to support her, but Swift kind of starts getting bored of it right away, and the quality of his contributions diminish, and Sheridan seems to be doing more and more of the work until after, I think, 18 issues, he abandons the project completely. And in the colophon of the final issue of the Intelligencer, Sheridan writes this kind of, very short poetic verse that expressly acknowledges Sarah Harding in her own right as a printer and publisher of the Draper letters, which previously had been kind of ascribed solely to her husband. And we have an actual public acknowledgement from someone who knew them both and was intimately associated with this printing project, a public acknowledgement that Sarah Harding was a printer in her own right of the Draper letters, so some of the most significant documents in Irish political history. One of her last Swift commissions was A Modest Proposal, which some of us may have had occasion to read in high school or after, held up as one of the great works of satire of all time. And the reason that, we wanted to look at this anecdote in some detail is, those of us who know a little bit about Irish 18th century printing, which is still super understudied, probably know that, this is the point where Faulkner kind of swoops in and becomes this celebrity publisher / bookseller, and really leverages this relationship with Swift and the Swift fame, and actually does some things that today we would kind of recognize as stealing the intellectual property of the Harding's press. So like starting new periodicals with names of things that they already published 10 years ago that people are familiar with, taking over the relationship with Jonathan Swift. And there's a kind of open question here. What would Swift's career have been like had he stuck with a printer who was really at the lower level of the scale of what they could actually do? Is Swift's astronomical success as a public individual actually kind of bound up with his moving away from the Hardings and moving to this really very commercial publisher, who a lot of, at least one contemporary scholar, really regards as a betrayer of the Hardings, and someone who seriously undercut them? I don't have the answers. Just wanted to put this out there as a really, really kind of complex interstice of wealth, prestige, gender, economics, fame, subversion, law. It's kind of all here. So this is one of my favorite sort of stories in the exhibit, although it doesn't have a happy ending. We don't actually know what happened to Sarah Harding. She stops printing around 1729, 1730. There's no further evidence of her imprint. We don't know if she passed away. We don't know if she continued to live. But one thing seems quite clear, which is that printing, which was probably never 100% of her income, was something that at a certain point she simply couldn't afford to do anymore.
So just to end, we're going to talk very briefly about a couple of women printmakers whose works are represented in the Rare Book collection at McMaster. So printmaking is kind of an adjacent industry to book printing. So these are prints that would be produced to kind of hang on your wall or frame, so large illustrations. Hannah Lyons recently published a really fascinating dissertation on this topic, and she describes how the trade in England for prints was dominated by men, but women were really, again, playing a significant role. She has identified approximately 34 women who work professionally as printmakers, and she points out that their contributions have been obscured because there's these three overriding issues. And the first is that there's just a general lack of scholarly attention given to women artists. Secondly, a lack of attention given to printmaking. And thirdly, lack of attention to printmaking that is reproducing other art. And a lot of these women printmakers, because they were not creating original works, they were creating engraved copies of paintings, for example, they just weren't considered to be at the same level as more famous artists, so they haven't been looked at the same level of detail. The image here you see is Angelica's Ladies Library. So Angelica Kaufmann was a very well-known Swiss-born painter at the end of the 18th century in England. She was known for her neoclassical paintings, but she also produced engravings. In this book, intended for a young female audience, she designed the 8 engraved plates that accompany the text. And then if we go on to the next slide, Caroline Watson. So this is just an example of how do we figure out we had Caroline Watson in our collection. I was cataloging a new book that was part of the Paul Fritz donation, and I saw this engraving underneath. It said engraved by Caroline Watson, engraver to Her Majesty, and I was like, oh wow, this is a woman engraver who had this official role to Queen Charlotte of Bridgerton fame. You may have seen that series. So Caroline Watson was a very successful engraver. She and her aunt, Elizabeth Judkins, were trained by her father, who was a mezzotint printmaker, James Watson. Caroline went on to specialize in stipple engraving and also other techniques like aquatint. In 1785, she published a stipple engraved portrait of Princess Mary, dedicated it to Queen Charlotte, and that was kind of how she got this role as the official engraver to the Queen. So if we go on to the next page, she was hired by William Haley to create the engravings that would appear in his biography of the artist George Romney. So Watson, again, produces these really beautiful reproductions of paintings by Romney, but that are almost like artworks in their own right, just how striking they are. And again, at the bottom of each, you see engraved by Caroline Watson, the official engraver to her queen. So she's really publicizing this role that she has. So she was able to support herself through her work, and she actually lived with her aunt for most of her life. So they were both successful as printmakers at that time. So I do recommend the research that's being done by Hannah Lyons on this topic of women printmakers in England during the late 18th, early 19th century. So just, I see we're going to have the call numbers for these books will actually be included in the online version of our presentation, but we're going to conclude now with next steps.
So as Ruth-Ellen alludes to here, one of the outcomes of this project has been actually helping us to build our own collections infrastructure, because when we started looking, we started finding. And Ruth-Ellen, one of the things she's working on right now is on one hand cataloging uncatalogued acquisitions, but also on ameliorating and improving existing catalog records. So in one sense, it's been an opportunity for Ruth-Ellen and myself as librarians and curators to develop our own knowledge of the collection, which is important, but also an opportunity to improve these catalog records, improve through those catalog records the access and the ability of other scholars and other individuals who might be interested to find the women in print and to see their contributions. And we were left with a sense of certainly more yet to be found. I think during the cataloging of the Paul Fritz copy of the engraving, Ruth-Ellen realized that we already had a copy of that book, which did not acknowledge the woman's contributions. So we were able to ameliorate that. And the more we looked, the more we found. When this was kind of an idea in our eyes, we looked in a kind of a narrow way, and we kept finding new things to the point where eventually we were like, okay, we have to winnow it down. Like, this didn't make the cut. This didn't make the cut. Not because of any problems with the books. We just wanted to kind of have a disciplined exhibit. There's way more there to be found. So we're looking forward to continuing to engage with this. We want to particularly acknowledge the, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, you go ahead, actually.
Okay, I just wanted to acknowledge the excellent work that's being done by our colleagues, especially Michelle Levy, Kate Croker, Kate Osmond, and Brian Tarpley, who are looking after respectively the Women's Print History Project and the Women in Book History Bibliography, both of which were invaluable to us in preparing this presentation and this exhibit. We're also happy to announce that an online exhibit is now available. We're still making a few final tweaks, but that can be shared after this webinar with people who want to explore these artifacts a little bit more. We're also going to have a featured collection in our library catalog coming soon. The exhibit will be viewable in person from now until April. And if you come visit to see the exhibit, which we would love, why not extend the visit and do a little work with this collection? We're extremely proud of it. It's one of the best 18th century collections out there, and we're constantly finding new and amazing things there. So please feel welcome to come and discover some of this stuff with us. Thank you.
And I guess we don't have a lot of time, but Jillian, I was wondering if I could just address the second question that we were going to talk about.
Yes, for sure. So we have time for just this one question, which was pre-submitted. The question was, in putting together this collection, did you consider the works of Mary Ann Shadd and other POC women who started presses?
So I really like to thank the person who submitted this question, because for this exhibition, we were focusing on the hand press period. We didn't have the opportunity to include works from the later in the 19th century. And that's really when we see more and more easily identifiable examples of women of color and people of color who are working in the printing trades. That's not to say that they didn't exist before in the hand press period. It's just that they're less obvious from looking at the books that we have in our collection. For those of you who aren't familiar with Mary Ann Shadd, she's an extremely important individual. She became the first Black woman in North America to establish and edit a newspaper, and one of the very first early newspaper women in Canada. So they've recently created a statue in her honor in Windsor. So I would recommend that you look a bit, do a search, learn more about Mary Ann Shadd. Unfortunately, we don't have copies of her newspaper at McMaster. I would like to mention just a upcoming event that's linked to this topic of people of color in book history, and so that there's a call for submissions from the papers of the Bibliographical Society of Canada. The theme is disrupting whiteness within special collections, bibliography, and book history. And so this is being organized by our colleagues, Rachel Harris and JP Mongeau. And so Bridget's going to include a link to that call for papers in the chat. And then finally, in terms of this topic, I think McMaster's collections are much more representative in terms of archives in the more contemporary periods. So we have really important archives of individuals like Basil H. Johnson. And then Jillian mentioned Maria Campbell in her introduction. There's actually going to be a 50-year anniversary of Maria Campbell's memoir, Half-Breed, in person at McMaster. And so that there's going to be a series of events in the evening of November 17th, I believe. And Maria Campbell herself will be there. And the library will also be there with examples from the archives linked to that memoir. So I do encourage you to check that out.
Thank you so much, Ruth-Ellen. So that brings us to time today. I want to thank Myron, Ruth-Ellen, Bridget, and the team at the library, and also all of you for joining us today. The recording of this talk will be available in a few weeks on the McMaster YouTube channel. Please fill out the survey that will pop up for you at the end of the webinar, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Goodbye.